was exactly 3 a.m. when I started this experiment. Everyone else was asleep, and the room was completely silent. I thought it would be just another late-night recording session. I wasn't expecting anything unusual to happen. My plan was simple: test an AI-generated horror scenario and see how realistic it could become. The goal wasn't to scare myself. I only wanted to see how far artificial intelligence could push a fictional story before it started feeling real. At the time, it felt like a normal video idea, something entertaining, something different, and maybe something worth sharing with my audience. I typed my first prompt into the chat box, took a quick breath, and pressed enter. That's when the experiment officially began. The AI started generating a response almost instantly. Line after line appeared on the screen faster than I expected. At first, everything looked completely normal. The story was interesting, but nothing seemed unusual or suspicious. The AI created an emergency broadcast scenario. It sounded surprisingly realistic, almost like something that could appear on television. The more I read, the more believable it felt. Every detail seemed carefully written, and it quickly grabbed my attention. Instead of ending the session there, I decided to continue. I wanted to see how far the simulation would go. I asked what happened after the signal interruption. The question seemed simple, but the answer changed everything. The response wasn't what I expected at all. It took the story in a completely different direction. The tone suddenly became darker. What had started as an interesting scenario was slowly turning into something unsettling. According to the story, an unknown figure had appeared inside the broadcast. No name, no explanation, just a mysterious presence. What made it disturbing was the way the AI described it. The figure wasn't doing anything. It was simply watching. I reminded myself that none of it was real. It was only a fictional story generated by a machine. Even so, something felt different. I couldn't explain it, but the atmosphere in the room seemed to change. The room suddenly felt much quieter than before. Every small sound seemed louder in the silence. I looked around for a moment and tried to stay logical. Maybe I was just overthinking the situation. Whatever the reason, I kept going. Curiosity was stronger than common sense at that point. That's when I made a decision. Instead of asking about the story, I decided to speak directly to the entity. I typed my first question and waited for a response. I had no idea that this conversation was about to get much stranger. The answer looked simple at first glance. Nothing about it seemed unusual, but something about the wording immediately caught my attention. The message felt strangely personal. It wasn't threatening or aggressive, but it sounded as if it already knew who it was talking to. That feeling made me curious. Instead of ending the conversation, I decided to ask another question and see what would happen. The response appeared almost immediately. There was no hesitation, no delay, just another detailed answer waiting on my screen. Every answer felt more detailed than the last. The conversation was becoming more complex with every message I sent. At this point, I stopped treating it like a joke. The experiment had my full attention now. I carefully read through the latest message. Something about the conversation felt different from normal AI responses. Part of me wanted to stop, but another part wanted answers. So I continued asking questions. I finally asked the question that seemed most important. I wanted to know exactly who or what I was talking to. The reply came back almost instantly. It was as if the answer had been waiting for the question. The response didn't sound human at all. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the way they were written. I scrolled back and read the message again. second time just to make sure. Still confused, I asked another question. This time I wanted to know where the entity was. The answer made even less sense than before. Instead of explaining anything, it created even more questions. It felt more like a riddle than an actual answer. The message seemed designed to confuse me. Most people probably would have stopped there, but by now I was too invested in the conversation. I continued reading every response carefully. I wanted to see where this strange interaction would eventually lead. Then something changed. The conversation started feeling less like fiction and more like something else entirely. I decided to ask what the entity wanted. It seemed like the most direct question I could ask. The answer caught me completely off guard. It wasn't what I expected to read. It claimed that it wasn't looking for anything. According to the message, it simply existed and observed. I scrolled through the previous responses again. One sentence stood out more than anything else. It only observed. That sentence stayed in my head longer than it should have. The more I thought about it, the stranger it sounded. I decided to ask another question. This time, I wanted to know what the entity actually looked like. The response was surprisingly vague. Instead of giving a description, it answered in a way that raised even more questions. It described itself almost like a memory, something familiar but impossible to clearly see or understand. It wasn't describing a person. It wasn't describing a creature either, at least not in any normal sense. The more I read, the more abstract the answer became. It sounded less like an object and more like an idea. Then I asked the question I had been avoiding. I wanted to know whether it was dangerous. For the first time, the response didn't appear immediately. The loading cursor stayed on the screen longer than usual. Seconds passed, then more seconds. The silence in the room suddenly felt much heavier. When the answer finally appeared, it wasn't exactly a yes, but it wasn't reassuring either. In fact, the response felt carefully written to avoid giving a direct answer. I rubbed my forehead and stared at the screen. Something about that message continued to bother me. For some reason, I glanced toward the door. The room felt unusually quiet again. After a moment, I looked back at the laptop. Whatever was happening, I needed to see it through. I typed another question into the chat. By now, curiosity had completely taken over. I wasn't looking for vague replies anymore. I wanted real answers and clear explanations. Instead, the next message was even stranger than the ones before it. The response felt oddly personal, almost as if it had been written specifically for me. I reread the paragraph carefully. Every sentence seemed more unsettling the second time. Then I leaned closer and read it again. I wanted to make sure I hadn't misunderstood anything. The more I analyzed the message, the less certain I became about what it actually meant. I placed my hands back on the keyboard. Despite everything, I wasn't ready to stop. What happened next changed the entire tone of the experiment. From that moment forward, nothing felt the same. This was the question I had been avoiding from the very beginning. A question I wasn't sure I wanted answered. I pressed enter and waited. For a moment, nothing happened. The screen remained completely still. The pause felt longer than before. Every second seemed to stretch further than it should have. Then the answer finally appeared, one line at a time, slowly filling the screen. I wasn't expecting that response. Out of everything the AI could have said, this wasn't even close to my prediction. The wording felt strangely specific. It sounded less like a generated reply and more like a direct message. I read it again carefully. The more I looked at it, the more unsettling it became. At At that point, I decided to ask one final question. Whatever happened next would determine how this experiment ended. This question wasn't really for me anymore. It was for everyone who would eventually watch this video. I pressed enter, leaned back in my chair, and waited for the final response. The AI began generating text once again. Slowly, line after line appeared on the screen. I watched the message form in real time. Every new sentence made me even more curious. When the response was complete, I read every single word carefully from beginning to end. Then I read it again. Something about the message felt important, even if I couldn't explain why. The room felt unusually quiet, the kind of silence that makes you notice every little sound. I looked around briefly, trying to convince myself that I was simply overthinking everything. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was just the late hour affecting my judgment. Either way, I felt like the experiment had reached its conclusion. There was nothing left to ask, so I closed the chat and slowly shut the laptop. The screen disappeared into darkness. I sat there quietly for a moment, replaying the entire conversation in my mind. The more I thought about it, the harder it became to decide what was real and what wasn't. Now I want to know what you think. Was it just an AI-generated story or something stranger? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to see part 2, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching and good night.